Right. Kia ora mai koutou. Ko Sporle toku ingo, he uri o haua Ngāti Apa Rangatane me Te Raraunga. Welcome everybody, my name's Andrew Sporle, and I am the session convener for this session. And this session again has an Indigenous data sovereignty focus, as some of this morning's keynotes did, but it's got a slightly different angle, and that angle is, what have we learnt so far? So this session is specifically about the transformative impact of the care principles and Māori data sovereignty. So it's looking at lessons from Aotearoa New Zealand in particular. So what have we learnt so far from trying to implement the Global Indigenous Data Alliance's care principles in a particular nation-state context? Right. Okay, use the clicker instead. So basically, we're going to run through some case studies from a decade of work in Māori data sovereignty and governance. My role as convener is not only to cat herd your speakers in terms of time, but to lay down a little bit of context about what the data environment is like in New Zealand, what the political environment is like in New Zealand, and what the data governance, Indigenous data governance environment in New Zealand. And that will lay the context for the case studies that you hear later on. You'll be hearing from 6 different case studies. First of all, we'll hear from Kiri and Larissa, and then we'll hear from Dan. Tori will join us in Zoom. Phil Wilcox is here, and then Lara will come up again and summarise and pull the key themes from the talks that you've just heard. So we're going to end up with some hearing about some case studies, and this clicker is not working. Right, okay. So just a very quick recap. When we're talking about data sovereignty, we're talking about data should be governed or subject to the laws of the nation in which it is stored. Indigenous data sovereignty is different. It talks about provenance. It talks about where the data comes from. So Indigenous data sovereignty is about the data being subject to the laws from the nation from which it was collected, and that includes tribal and Indigenous nations. Now, Indigenous data sovereignty has been happening for a long time. It's one of those things that actions came before policy, and those actions can be seen in these international events and international organisations. And I want to draw your particular attention to the FNIGC and their OCAP principles. Now, the FNIGC in Canada were the kind of not only the conceptual leaders but the operational leaders of Indigenous data sovereignty. But at this stage, Indigenous data sovereignty was kind of quite relatively isolated in terms of particular nation states, particular data sets, or in the case of the International Group on Indigenous Health Measurement, but very, very particular contexts. And what happened was that people started getting together. And they started getting together and talking about Indigenous data sovereignty because it actually has some really key international foundations. And the first is the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and you can't look at Article 15 and implement Article 15 of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, unless you start talking about Indigenous data sovereignty. Also, prior to that, the WHO's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health started talking about the adequacy and control of measures of Indigenous wellbeing. So in this context, we start to see professional bodies starting to develop approaches to Indigenous data. And so I've just put these the 3 key ones down there. There was one that's fresh off the boat as of last week, where the International Statistics Institute has now created a steering group on Indigenous data. So it's a global movement. It's a movement based initially on action and quite specific contexts. In New Zealand, the Indigenous data sovereignty movement actually began in Australia. Right, which is kind of ironic, but it was the initial meeting to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty was funded by the Australasian Socials Science Academy, and that happened in July 2015, and it was an event held at ANU, and it involved both Australian and New Zealand researchers and one United States researcher. So what we're looking at today is where have we got to in the decade since that first meeting. Very quickly after that initial meeting, the Māori Data Sovereignty Movement, Te Mana Raraunga, had our first meeting. And that was followed the following year, just 6 or 7 months later, by going international. And the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association conference in Honolulu had an Indigenous data sovereignty session, and we actually had to move rooms. It was so popular. So we're beginning to see something emerging out of perceived need, out of action, and out of isolated sort of context into a general movement. Te Mana Raraunga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Movement, is an advocacy organisation. We were a group of Māori technologists and Indigenous data nerds, and we advocated for data rights and interests, data governance, we're going to come back to that, data storage and security, and data access and control. And all of this was about realising the value of Indigenous data, recognising that the value in Indigenous data can only be realised as A, the data is protected, and B, the data is governed and controlled in safe and appropriate ways. And by appropriate, I mean in aligning with the values of where that data came from. Te Mana Raraunga set up an organisation, set up a website, and started to develop a charter, like a key concept of ideas and how it would operate as an advocacy organisation. And within that, some principles, really key principles, as well as developing some resources for people to implement those principles. And those principles were, we spent a lot of time on them, about 6 or 7 months, and that enabled us to kind of conceptualise what we mean by Indigenous data sovereignty and what are some of the key values and approaches in there. But those approaches didn't go as far as operationalising it. This was the idea that that data sovereignty, Indigenous data sovereignty, gets operationalised in particular contexts. And we weren't going to be specific enough for each and individual context, but we could draw out the underlying principles that people could then apply in their own context. So that's what we did, and we published them, and they've got huge traction. Quickly following on from this, and following on from that Canberra workshop, lots of Indigenous or national Indigenous data sovereignty movements started, and you can see here a list of where things are currently at. So they cover large parts of the globe, mostly Anglophone countries, but also large and very active organisations in the Sapmi and Sami nations in what we call Scandinavia, and more recently the Pacific, in the Pacific countries. But you're seeing other national and international collectives being developed in South America and Southeast Asia at the same time. From these emerging national organisations, the idea came to form a global organisation. And the global organisation, and this umbrella organisation, was to represent it was a collective of collectives. It was a head organisation to represent us at the international stage in a way that no national organisation could. And this organisation was called GIDA, was the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And we had our first meeting in the Basque country in Spain, which was quite appropriate because GIDA in the Basque language means guide. And that's our very first meeting there. And yes, I'm the one there on the phone, and on the side, and I'm talking to my mum. And so we had this event at the Basque University in 2016. So you can see things are moving quite quickly. So we've gone from individual national organisations to setting up a global organisation. And this organisation, under the leadership, under the direction and with the energy of primarily Steph, let me get her name right, Steph. Yeah, okay.
I think her last name's changed.
Okay, she, from University of Arizona, she put a lot of energy into this, and this organisation started to get very active. And one of the things they did was they said that the FAIR principles of that we see everywhere in data science, of that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, isn't sufficient. And what we need is supplementary guidelines for data governance that are based on values. And so she led Gita into the development of the CARE principles of data governance, which was about collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and a key role of ethics and values. And these CARE principles were developed in 2018. So you can see this movement is actually rapidly developing. It's gone global. It's starting to develop global policies. And the idea behind this is that if we can develop these broad principles, we can then start to look at how those principles might be modified in slight regional contexts, but also how they get applied within individual nation states, Indigenous nation states, and in particular Indigenous contexts. And today's session is about one of those contexts. Very quick introduction to the New Zealand population, just in case you don't know where Aotearoa New Zealand is. We're the kind of east islands of Australia, or Australia's the west island of us. We're down there in the southwest corner of the South Pacific. We're about 5 million people-ish, very ethnically diverse, and about 18% Indigenous, which is about just under 1 million people, with a young, and it's a young population with a median age of about 26. In terms of our Indigenous situation, we are a former British colony. There was a declaration of independence by tribes, mainly from the northern part of New Zealand, back in 1835, and that was followed by a treaty with Queen Victoria, which established the protection of the British Crown, equal rights and citizenship for Indigenous peoples. Indigenous people control their possessions, treasured possessions, which included land. And so this treaty was the basis of British settlement and subsequent government. It hasn't always gone to plan, so there has been one or two protests. So this has actually informed how Te Mana Raraunga, the Māori Indigenous data sovereignty, engages. And how we engage is down at the bottom of this diagram. So we do the work, or mahi. And we, as advocates, work with government agencies directly. But there's another organisation, Te Kāhui Raraunga, and they work in the governance space, and they engage directly with government ministers, but there's some people who operate in between the two organisations. We work closely together, but we have separate goals and separate ways of working. That tribally led group that engages directly with government is called Te Kāhui Raraunga, as I mentioned. They are an independent trust formed by the iwi chairs data leadership group. The iwi chairs are the chair people of the nation states governance organisations, with Indigenous nation state governance organisations within New Zealand. And they led the treaty-based, partnership-based engagement on co-governance in New Zealand. And in doing that, they do it under this agreement with Statistics New Zealand and our Department of Internal Affairs, which is called the Mana Oriti Agreement, or Equal Standing Agreement. So it's a way of saying we've got equal standing as we negotiate through this. And so one of the things in terms of the context for the talks that follow is that if the Article 2 of this treaty, the Te Reti of Waitangi, guarantees Māori control over taonga, over treasured possessions, and if data is a taonga, how have the CARE principles informed the Indigenous data sovereignty action in New Zealand, especially in the 10 years since the founding of Te Mana Raraunga? Now, the speakers that follow will give you individual case studies. I will not introduce the speakers one by one. I'm going to because I won't be able to do that justice, because in the Indigenous data space, we all wear many hats and many roles. So I'm going to let them describe those, who they are and what they do in their own terms. So the first speakers are Kiri and Larissa. And if if you'd like to come up, and I will find your slides, hopefully. Which one's you?
Pants on. That's a good question. Kiri, which one was ours? I don't know. I think they're all open. If you hover over. Oh, PowerPoint? Yeah, we are this one. Gorge. And is this?
Right. You guys good for 10 minutes?
We're good for 10 minutes.
Okay, each speaker will have 10 minutes, and you'll get a 5-minute and a 2-minute warning.
Where were those for you?
Those are for me, yeah. Okay, go for it.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Māori ora ki te whare, ko ai tēnei wahine mihi atu ana, ko Kiri tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei no pare hauraki whānui, ko Ngāti Maru, Ngāti Tamatara, me Ngāti whanaunga ōku iwi. Hello everybody, my name is Kiri, I am from the beautiful Hauraki, and yeah, thank you for coming along today. Tēnā tātou katoa, he uria hau no Te Raraunga, ngā puhi, Ngāti Pāua me Tainui Hoki. Kia ora everybody, I'm Larissa and I come from the far north of the North Island, all the way through to the mighty heart of the North Island. Our talk today, so we're sharing this case study of research that we're currently engaging in. We're in the early stages of it, and while it isn't necessarily a success story, it is one that is full of hope and aspirations, and hopefully we can kind of share some of our, I guess, thinking that we're developing as we move through this research project. So I'm grateful, thank you to Andrew for kind of laying the foundation, providing some context and offering some definitions. But they're here again for you to engage, like to read and kind of think about. And I think probably the most important one that I would draw your attention to is Māori data governance. So we're kind of really thinking about what are the principles, structures and accountability mechanisms that exist for Māori data governance to be given effect in a research institution, in particular a university. So Māori research data governance, data sovereignty is our kaupapa. So essentially, just to give some context for this project, I was contacted last year by Tahu Kukutai, who was in one of those photos up there, one of the founding members of Te Mana Raraunga, and basically trying to develop a research project that looked at how we might give effect to Māori data governance in New Zealand universities, recognising, of course, that universities are powerhouses of knowledge generation and have been, they have a really important role to play in the life cycle of data. Yeah, absolutely. So it feels really like fast-paced to move through all of this.
We got it. Do the next slide.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of further contextualise what we're talking about, our research program has 3 kind of core objectives. One of them is thinking about findability, so understanding the scope and scale of data that universities do hold, and in particular Māori research data, so data generated through research activities that are about Māori, the communities that we live in, the environments that are important to us. And it's really hard because there is no kind of consistent standard for storing data, noting the provenance of data, all of those kind of issues. So findability is an issue that we realise is present, so that is one objective. What we're looking at is the governance, so what are the levers, where do we need to think about implementing data governance within universities, and then there's a third objective which is led out of Te Wānanga o Aotearoa, which is looking at kind of maintaining connection between the data and the communities from which that data comes from, and that's a kind of data sovereignty project specifically.
And for those who are not from New Zealand, Te Whare Wānanga o Aotearoa is a Māori what's the word for it in
Tertiary
Australia?
education
Tertiary
provider.
education, thank you. This is us.
And this is our research team.
Research team for Addictive 2. Okay.
I guess this kind of informs our context as well, where the research emerges from. Just a recognition that universities and their current action and approach to managing their role as kind of data stewards are complicit in a kind of harm and colonialism and ongoing poor data practices. So that, I guess, is really the context, and this has come out of IIRC and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance communique there as well.
Okay, so we are doing a case study of the University of Auckland, Waipapa Taumatarau, which is where we're both from. So the University of Auckland have created this incredible strategic vision for 2030. But it was released for us to slowly kind of go over several different years, and it's called Taumata Teite. And in it, you can see that Māori data sovereignty was actually embedded in our strategic vision. And so they put the beautiful aspiration of becoming a Māori data sovereignty organisation. And while that's an incredibly powerful aspiration, there have not yet been complete levers to show us the pathway to get there. And so that's kind of why it's really exciting to think about data governance and what that can mean for us. And so we thought we would look at identifying the opportunities for the implementation of Māori data governance at the university. And so because it's this beautiful aspirational statement to be Māori data sovereignty led, there were 2 reports that were started in 2020 that I was actually a part of. And then they were finally published and produced in 2022. And that was around the research data management stocktake. And then a separate evaluation was done on that from an external reviewer. That was the evaluation of the Māori data sovereignty section and the report that came from out of that. And so we obviously recognise that Māori data sovereignty was highlighted as a priority area not only within the strategic plan, but also within research data management. And so here is the dimension of Māori data sovereignty from the maturity model of the research data management report. And so we start off with initial, move through to development, and then if you go real close, defined, managed, and optimised. And so this was a pathway to become a Māori data sovereignty-led space.
I think what you will see there is that what they've tried to do is take the Māori data sovereignty principles as they have been written, as Andrew explained, by Te Mana Raraunga, and map them onto this coordinate model. And there are multiple other dimensions within this data capability maturity model, and Māori data sovereignty is just one of them. But really what's clear when we're looking at this model is that, or when we're looking at this dimension in particular, is it looks really full and robust. And if you were to kind of read through and look, it seems quite promising. There's a lot of things that seem like, 6.2, research and optimise. Research data management is aligned with the principles of whanaungatanga, rangatiratanga, kotahitanga, whakapapa, manaakitanga, and kaitiakitanga. And these are the Māori data sovereignty principles, right? And that seems really promising. But what we kind of realise as we're doing this research is as robust and full as this maturity or this dimension looks, when we actually separate it out according to the principles, it's quite fragmented.
So this is one of the principles. So this is whakapapa, relationships, and there are 3 separate parts of whakapapa, and that is context, data disaggregation, and future use. And so from what you previously saw of the maturity model, this is how they have actually mapped out from the principles. So we did this fun activity where we mapped the principles to the maturity model, and yeah, as you can see, it's a little bit fragmented.
It kind of it means that there's no real way to measure success, to measure movement from initial through to optimise, and it's really difficult then for the university to be able to assess the strength of their initiatives when it comes to Māori data sovereignty, but it's also difficult for us as researchers to understand what we need to do to meaningfully give effect to Māori data sovereignty through our own research processes and practices. And it really highlighted to us that when we look at this dimension in its fragmented kind of state, that's also reflected and mirrored in the way that initiatives are rolled out in the university. It's quite sprawling. You can go to the next slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really sprawling. There doesn't seem to be kind of any clear pathway. We've had to kind of go across into all of these different spaces and have conversations with people to try and wrangle all of the initiatives to understand what actions have been taken as a result of, you know, as always part of that aspiration. And we realised very quickly that what we needed to do was have a look and understand what the Māori data ecosystem looks like, so that we understand where our kind of leverage points need to be in the conversations we need to be having. And it's really quite challenging is what we're finding.
It's hard out here.
Yeah.
I think the gap between policy and practice is obviously quite heavily noticeable. The pathway is not clear. It's shrub at the moment and it's looking like gorse. But I think the well-intentioned policies are great, but they still remain quite aspirational without the clear pathway, and I think that's the frustrating part of it. And there is this understanding of policy failure and accepting that there is potential failure for these policies to go through. So while we have these fantastic aspirations, there is potential for the policies to just not go anywhere. And I think that's where that struggle of that pathway sits. Thank you. And because of that disconnected implementation, the principles are being applied everywhere and everyone talks about the principles, but we're not actually able to see them in action. Next, yeah. So why is it important that we understand the research data ecosystem? So we've taken the ecosystem approach to really understand what Māori data do universities hold and how can we make sure that we are actually wrapping the principles around them in an actionable way. And so we're identifying systemic gaps, leveraging the existing governance hooks, engaging with the right stakeholders and creating enforceable solutions. So identifying those gaps, did you want to talk about any of this? Or do you have any?
Oh no, I guess just the point is that there is a lot of good intent. People are generally well-intentioned, and of all the people that have sat down and had conversations with us, there is a keen interest in seeing what this might look like, but we can't rely on good intentions. You know, if there's anything that our current political kind of environment is telling us right now, is that you can't rely on good intentions. You have to have enforceable mechanisms in place. And so for us, that's what the data ecosystem approach offers, is an opportunity to think about how do we actually give Māori data governance teeth within our institution.
And I think also like leveraging on the existing governance hooks is quite easy there too. We're not looking to create a brand new wheel. We're just looking to see where Māori data governance can already latch onto mechanisms that we've already got within our university structure too, to create those kind of enforceable solutions. And so this is us kind of just going from this pathway, we're still using our pathway analogy, clearing that path. And so the foundation is like understanding the data ecosystem, then the action of being aspirational and practical, moving from theory to praxis, and then the outcome of strengthening our data practices.
Oh, yeah, no, that's fine. We actually were supposed to have 15 minutes because we're combining two. Yeah, no.
Thank you.
Just so that we're not so scared about time. But I think one of the things that we've realised, so if we thought about a timeline, we have, no, we can go to the next one. We have the stated aspiration from the university in 2020 to be Māori data sovereignty led. Then in 2021, I think the Research Data Management Stocktake report and accompanying Māori data sovereignty report were kind of published, which was really great. They gave us recommendations for implementation. That was wonderful. And then in 2022, the IIRC communique said, hey, universities maintain complicity in data harm and colonialism. 2023, GITA kind of shared that similar sentiment again and said this universities are not safe spaces. And then in 2023, the Māori data governance model was published or was put out by Te Kāhui Raraunga. And I guess what we're looking at is understanding that there has been limited progress in the 5 years since the stated aspiration from our university. There has been an appointment of a person who's responsible for Māori data sovereignty within our institution, but one person in 45,000 people within our organisation tells us it's probably not enough. And quite frankly, the only word that I can use to describe the way Māori data sovereignty has spread out through our university is random. It's random, it's fragmented and it's uncoordinated, but we see potential in the Māori data governance model to kind of give some practical steps that we can think about moving or updating that maturity model, that Māori data sovereignty dimension, from initial to optimised in ways that is robust and full and allows us to see that pathway forward. And so what we're trying to do is, rather than apply the principles of Māori data sovereignty, we're thinking about these, they're called data po, that's what Te Kāhui Raraunga have called them, and how can we map the data po onto the maturity model, because we believe there's far more opportunities to think about Māori data governance within institutions than trying to have these institutions that are they're not there for data sovereignty. They don't want to give up control. So maybe Māori data governance is a better way forward, and we kind of think that we can update our model to better reflect the aspirations and needs of not just Māori as the community impacted, but also researchers who are having to give effect to these things in meaningful ways. Yeah.
And I think I will also add, thank you, that these PO are, this governance model is incredibly detailed and like several pages long, because it puts real beautiful examples in and questions to kind of reflect on each different PO. We also went through a fun.
It was fun for us.
It was fun for us. It was fun for us, where we mapped the Māori data governance model to Te Mana Raraunga's principles, and they sat together incredibly nicely. So aligning with Māori data governance doesn't mean that we're not also aligning to the Māori data sovereignty principles. And I think that was also quite powerful to know that we were reaffirming the things that we wanted to know from the principles, which means latching those onto the maturity model for the research data management of the University of Auckland was not going to force one to be better than the other, but they actually all just kind of aligned seamlessly, which I think was something to kind of highlight and prioritise as well. Oh,
yeah, we've already talked about that. We can sit there. I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to push for is that recognition that we can't sit in symbolic commitments, right? The symbolic commitments, doth butter no parsnips, no. No, they're not good enough for kind of giving effect to Māori data sovereignty. They don't support communities to be meaningfully engaged in the process either. We believe that Māori governance of Māori data is an expression of tino rangatiratanga, or our kind of authority, autonomy, agency, sovereignty, and our project is about creating real tools and frameworks to shift power. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
No, time's up.
Cool, ka pai, thank you.
Thank you. Do you want me to leave all the tech for you?
Thanks both. So there's an example of trying to implement Indigenous data sovereignty in the context of a large academic organisation, in fact New Zealand's largest academic organisation. and how when you're talking about large organisations, unless you're talking about governance, it's actually really hard to effect change. Now, what we're going to do is roll on to the next speaker, which is Associate Professor Lara Greaves, and we're going to save the questions till last, because as we're building up these case studies, we're going to see a series of themes emerge, which Lara is also going to enlighten us on as she sums up after the last speaker.
If I've got time.
If you've got time.
If I've got time. Tēnā koutou, hui hou no Ngāpuhi, ko la Greaves tōku ingoa, e mihi ana kia koutou katoa. My name is Lara Greaves and I'm an Associate Professor at Victoria University of Wellington in politics. And from the kind of big northern tribe, Ngāpuhi. So with this presentation, I was so excited. I've managed to unite my two things. So political science and Māori data sovereignty. I managed to get them together. Because for ages, I don't know if you've had this in your research context, you're doing something, and then you finally manage to bring them together and you feel a good sense of achievement. So basically, this is our orange guy. He's our election mascot. He's running along. They added a dog around 2020. Yeah, he likes to encourage us to go and vote. They just says it's time to vote. So that's why this presentation is orange. It's our neutral political colour. You may have seen Hana Rafiti Maipi Clark's haka video. It's gone all around the world. Look it up if you haven't, because it's an epic way, an epic demonstration of Māori in a colonial political system, just kind of doing our thing. And some just basic things about our voting context. We have reserved Māori electorates. We've had them since the 1860s. Generally, Māori voter turnout's about 10 to 15% lower than Pākehā white European population's turnout. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? So colonial system, why would you vote if it's not kind of your way of doing politics? But various studies have looked at this, but kind of, and this is some of my work in political science where we're kind of documenting the reasons given for this over time. Basically, Māori participate in different ways. There's been a lot of arguments. Some of my work has shown that Māori are more likely to do every other political activity than give donations, boycott products, and turn out to vote. So whether it's organising meetings in the community, putting up billboards, talking to friends and family about politics, Māori are more likely to do it. But the annoying thing is voter turnout's the one that changes the parliament, changes the government, and changes the political context, and means that we can enact good things like Māori data sovereignty. So I found myself in this really fortunate position under the last Labour government to be appointed by Cabinet to a once-in-a-generation review of our electoral laws. So I managed to actually get Māori data sovereignty recommendations into an independent review. And so there were 6 of us. We spent 2 years reviewing our electoral law, had about 6,000 submissions. You know, it was a lot of work. And some of our recommendations were that the Electoral Commission should prioritise establishing Māori governance over data collected, so Māori data governance. And I also managed to get one in there around researcher access to the electoral roll for sampling purposes. So researchers in New Zealand can get the electoral roll and sample participants off of it. So we managed to get that recommendation in there that they need to figure out some kind of plan, because we could see that that would be an issue. And we know that these things here could really help to build trust in the electoral system and actually then create better turnout and then, you know, perhaps create policy change and to enact Māori political aspirations in this colonial system. Again, this work is very incremental, very within Crown politics. We know that some of these recommendations would help, you know, and we can see that a data scandal in our electoral system is probably just going to undermine a lot of the work that people have been doing to build trust in all communities, right? So once I finished this electoral review, I was like, okay, so then the reality is, when you're in one of those reviews, there's limited resources in any given government department. Your reviews or the things that you want to do, it relies on the political will. So I thought, I'm going to pick up the recommendations and just kind of start doing them, so then they're easier to implement later on. So the government can later, you know, or the Electoral Commission, we've got this independent Electoral Commission, they can later pick them up, they can get the Greaves report, pick it up, it's got a nice infographic on the front page or something, and then they can just do it. Maybe wishful thinking, and they don't have to pay me, because our Electoral Commission, like very many, are underfunded. At one point last year, they only had 6 IT staff, which is just not enough for a country of 5 million people. So I figured I'd just kind of get into it and get stuck in. So I started mapping where the data occurs in the system. You know, we've got our electoral roll, there's contact details in the Electoral Commission, you know. We've got this interesting mechanism where there's the Tūhono Trust that can share Māori contact details with their iwi, with their tribe, in terms of keeping in touch with them and contact with them. That was an interesting thing that's kind of under-investigated. And then started investigating what the political parties are up to. And I'm not exactly sure that everything they do is legal, based on my understanding of the law. So that's a bit worrying. So taking a Māori data sovereignty lens actually has turned up a lot of, in doing the investigation, has turned up a lot of moments in this process. This is that Nation Builder software, a sort of screenshot of their website where they've said, oh, well, we helped Jacinda Ardern become Prime Minister. So I kind of found a lot of those sorts of points along the way where political parties are using our data for strategy-based turnout. So, you know, the left might go and door knock over there because they know, and try to turn people out to vote because they know they're more sympathetic to them. The right doesn't seem to know what's happening in terms of data access, which is really interesting. I'm not sure what they're up to, but I kind of found through this electoral review very different attitudes, all in the public submissions that we saw. So basically it seems as though the political parties are accessing our data, but there's no data access for Māori communities. So if you were in a small local community and you wanted to find out, hey, young people, Māori are a young population, how many are on the Māori electoral roll? How many turn out to vote? What's the story down, you know, there? How can I help? You know, you can't get access to that data to really know that. We did find a spreadsheet on the Electoral Commission website, and we have been trying to turn it into an app, but, you know, it's not very accessible or easy to use. Thank you for covering the Māori data governance model, yep. So one of the recommendations was, to start working through the Māori data governance model for the Electoral Commission. I know that they've been starting to think about that and ways to enact that. And then I started to think about, and this is just some images from a recent court case in New Zealand, well, I guess it's a few years ago now, about access to COVID-19 vaccine data, and where it's like, where individual level information might kind of erode privacy, or whether we go to the small unit. So I'm trying to work through a lot of those issues and how they might relate to voter turnout, because our political parties want access to live turnout. Our political parties want to know if, you know, Lara Greaves of whatever road, whatever street has voted or not, so they can come and knock on my door 2 days before the election and turn me out to vote or not. So started to explore these issues from Māori data sovereignty perspective. Making an app, trying to figure out ways to make these data that are publicly available, just more usable, and so people can work within their own communities to motivate turnout. Where smaller political parties as well can use it, because our Labour Party has like a really good database, our Greens have a really good database, but if you were running against them, you wouldn't necessarily have those resources to start collecting and linking that data. So just trying to think about how to make this all easier to access. And some of my advisors were saying, Māori advisors were saying, you know, what we need to also have those layers. Like, you know, is it the fact that that community over there, it's socioeconomic status for them? That's why, you know, that's the explainer of turnout for them. So, you know, that kind of helps them make a case when they're in these conversations for, you know, turnout and what's actually happening in communities. So, yeah, I've kind of been working through these different things, as well as stuff around calculating the Māori seats with Andrew, so that's been a long-running process. But the big issue for me in all of this work has been just everything changing all the time. So initially, the data that we got from the Electoral Commission website to start making the app, that's not really that relevant anymore, because those people now are completely disenfranchised and can't vote. So we've had these fundamental attacks on our rights, where even our Attorney General, who sits in the National Cabinet, says that it's a violation of rights. So we've just had attack after attack after attack after attack where this area is moving so fast. So yeah, it's a kind of, it starts with hope, this talk, and ends with we'll keep trying, but yeah, the moment we kind of get a paper written, they get rid of the census without proper consultation. You know, like we get an app, we start working on an app. Well, the whole voting landscape has changed and disenfranchised somewhere between 100 and 400,000 voters. So it's just been this moving feast of like, you know, you can get something in place, and there's still a lot of great people working in the public service, working in the Electoral Commission to keep doing this, and a lot of communities who have been motivated by this government to to start doing these things, but ultimately, yeah, it does come back to the Cabinet. So I don't really know where to go to from here, but happy to talk to anyone afterwards. Kia ora. Sorry for the bleak moment. I should have put something happy. Let's just go back to the guy running. Look, he's got his dog. He's got his dog.
So we're going to move from a national political context in terms of political data to something a little bit more specific, and I'll welcome Dr. Daniel Wilson to talk about his particular context of applying the care principles. Might be one of the open PowerPoints, is it?
Let's have a look. Ah, yes, got it. Tēnā koutou katoa. I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the Yugara and Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of this land, which is apt for a Māori data sovereignty presentation. Ko waio, who am I? Huri tēnei no Ngāpui me Ngāti Pikiao, ko Daniel Wilson tōku ingoa. I whakapapa up. This is Lake Mapere in the north, and this is the outlet into the Utukura River from where I whakapapa to. This is a bit of water sampling because we've got a lot of farming activity around the edge of the lake that is not very good. Basically, the lake is having a hard time. I lecture in computer science, and I've got a bunch of roles. I wrote them down, but it's not worth running through them because I always forget. But I teach in AI, in Māori data sovereignty and ethics, tech ethics. My academic training's in philosophy, but I used to work in software development, so I've got an interesting mix of curves. And we've heard presentations around rights and policies. What I want to do is switch into a bit more of the ethics, so heading, kind of converging a bit, but from a different direction, based on some research that I've been working on. So here are the care principles. I'm not going to go through each of these, this is from the paper that laid out the care principles. You can access that online. And there are 12 of them, right? So I won't go into detail in them, but I'm going to refer to them. Now, the research that I've been involved with recently was around, it was a health project related to the use of routinely collected health data for developing artificial intelligence, in this case, predicting dementia, mate wari. And so there's a bit of a tension. So there's a lack of data for Māori populations, and there are a lot of people who are very keen to serve Māori populations, so they're really wanting to get their hands on that data. But the question is, what do Māori think about the use of their health data for these tools? So I ran a project with a kaupapa Māori, a Māori culturally centred dementia support group. And we ran a couple of wānanga. This was culturally grounded knowledge sharing sessions to discuss the use of health data in different ways. And the idea was to let the Māori voice be heard in relation to health data use. Right? So this was seniors and their carers. It was very family focused. The focus was much more on supporting the family rather than the individual, right? Where a lot of our technology is focused on individual patients. So that's the background. And so these are along the top line there, the high-level themes that me and another Māori research assistant, we developed these from the transcripts. So along the top there, this was basically ground up, right? It was from the transcripts, not based on any framework. You've got questions around power and authority, so wanting to be able to control data use so that researchers knew that data, their data, using it was a privilege, right? Not an entitlement for them to use it, and they should have the power to be able to retract it. And then next we've got manaakitanga, so those T-shirts in Lara's presentation with, we do it for our mokopuna. It's for future generations, right? There was a strong message around that. So the benefits should not just go to the researchers, it should come back to the communities. But there was, a real keenness that data should be used to help people, not just do presentations or publish articles. We also have, I've got there, tapu restrictions and wairuatanga spiritual practices. These came out as important with respect to handling things like biological samples. They volunteered this. There was a suggestion, with these samples, that's our whakapapa. That's our genealogy right there. It's not just a blood sample, it's a sample of my blood, right? So there's strong connections there, and we want to treat them respectfully. And then just down here we've got whakaaetanga. So the whole consent practice. Our clinical consent practices are all individual-based, paper-based, legalistic, risk-managed. That is not everybody getting in a room, getting on the same page, collectively agreeing how we're going to go about things, and building relationships. That is the opposite of that. That is covering each other with, signing off on various things. So these were all coming through, these sub-themes from the transcripts. And then, given that mapping exercises seem to be a thing, I was having a look at the care principles and found, a good number of these are represented in the kinds of concerns and aspirations that these kaumātua wanted for their data. Right? They didn't know how their health data was being used. Right? This was an initial discussion. We were exploring it, but as we were working through it as a group, they were forming opinions about what is acceptable, what is not. Right? And there were a range. So this is not all of the care principles, but a good number, right, coming out. Now, here on the right-hand side of those 5 themes that I drew out, I was looking at another framework. This was written for the government, was for the Auditor General, around Māori perspectives on trust. And you can find easy sort of mappings between what they described in relation to a Māori perspective on trust: reciprocity, tikanga, relationality, power imbalances destroy trust. Right? So the tikanga aspect is the cultural ethics side of things. So what we seem to have been talking about with these themes was a Māori conception of trust. So there is a general philosophical notion of trust where somebody's trustworthy if they have a disposition to uphold their obligations. And the point here is that for Māori, the obligations are different. They run along these lines. It's around relationships. It's around making sure that the benefits are reciprocal, observing tikanga, and levelling those power relations. All right, so this is probably me saying the same points. Yes, so that top one I just said, right? So the relevant obligations are different. So within the transcripts, trust appears a good number of times. We didn't bring up the word trust, only in 2 of those instances, but lots of times trust came up in the discussion. So this is a fit with what we were seeing. And so many of the care principles articulate what is needed to give effect to what Indigenous communities care about when it comes to trust relationships, it seems. Right? So just thinking about the university and research, this is the current relationship. So on the right there, I use Merata Kawhiru and Paul Tapsell's spiral of innovation, takarangi model. There are limited resources, limited capacity for Māori spaces for innovation. All the resourcing is within the university, right? And the power dynamic is on that red arrow, right? You're in a dependence relationship if you're in a Māori space. It could get whipped away. The resourcing could get whipped away. Your colleagues could rage quit at the frustration of having to grate against all the policies to get anything done, and so on. It's a very sort of fragile position. Now, I guess this is the sort of the aspirational side here. So what we were talking about was, the care principles levelling out, right, the mana orite or equal power and authority relationship through sharing power, right, through forming relationships, reciprocity and so forth. So that's that middle bar. And then the other care principles that didn't appear in our transcripts are these ones down here: inclusive development and innovation, data for governance, that is, data for Māori to be able to measure what they're interested in and use it to make decisions, and for expanding capability and capacity. These are all enablers, right? This is about growing the capability and capacity, which is why I've got that big, larger size there. All right, so I think I'll just leave it there, really just trying to say that, the care principles is not just about, these about Te Tiriti o Waitangi treaty. It's also, you can get a good grounding from the ethics that come out of the community, right? Grassroots, flax roots ethics. So I'll just leave that there. Kia ora.
So we've gone from a context of looking at the care principles as an international sort of way of conceptualising Indigenous data sovereignty, to look at institutional practices, to look at practices with regards to electoral data, to look at what is actually coming out from grassroots concerns within a health research project with quite potentially highly sensitive data. And now we're going to move into the realm of official statistics with Tori Diamond talking about some of her recent work on Indigenous and on Māori health data in a New Zealand context. She's going to join us by Zoom, and hopefully the technician at the back is able to do that from there.
Oh,
yay. So, Tori, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yep, great. Coming through
Perfect.
loud and clear. We're going to get you to introduce yourself, and then you have 10 minutes, but I can't wave coloured cards at you, so you'll have to do your own timing. But I'm sure you...
That's fine.
Great. Thanks very much, Tori.
Thank you. Oh, I'll just share my slides. Sorry. Hopefully everyone can see that. Yep, cool. I'll just run with that. Just let me know if there's any issues. Kia ora koutou, ko te rai rahiri te maunga, ko ngā kahi te awa, ngā te toki te hapu, ko ngā pui te iwi, ko Tori Diamond tōku ingoa. Kia ora everyone, my name is Tori Diamond. I'm a PhD student in statistics at the University of Auckland, based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And yeah, thank you for having me via Zoom. Sorry I can't be there in person. But I'll be presenting on some of my previous research from a health data and official statistics perspective, and how Māori data sovereignty can be built onto this moving forward. So the first case study I'll be exploring is how population standards can cause issues for estimating Māori health outcomes. So Māori population standards are used in official statistics for age standardization. And age standardization, it's a common method used across the world for comparing groups with different age structures, so weighted by population standards such as the WHO or SAGE World Populations as examples. However, as we can probably tell, these standards can create issues And when we calculate Māori mortality rates, for example, using these world population standards, we can systematically underestimate the burden on Māori communities. So this is because age standardization uses population structures that don't reflect Māori demographics. So this isn't just a technical problem, it's a Māori data sovereignty violation as well. And so when choices are made about Māori without Māori governance, you're controlling the technical elements, the standards, the denominators, and the variables, which can impact and create problems for who are actually visible within the data, which solutions seem appropriate, and where resources actually flow. So this work, I will go into updates and extends on work by Bridget Robson and colleagues from 2007. And they argued that the Māori population structure is different to other populations, as we know, and therefore we need to create an Indigenous specific standard. So at this point in time, the Māori 2001 census population was actually used as a population standard moving forward. So it's still used to this day. So we actually need more timely estimates which reflect Māori population dynamics as well. So like I mentioned earlier, and as Andrew mentioned earlier actually, age standardization can be used when comparing populations with different age structures, but how different are these age structures? So in the first plot I've shown here, you can see that Māori, which are, hopefully you can see my mouse maybe, which are the darker blue and yellow bars there. We can see that there's a younger element there. So there's a younger population for Māori compared to non-Māori. And when we age standardize using non-Māori population structures, we're essentially asking what would Māori rates look like if Māori had a non-Māori age distribution, which doesn't really make sense. So it obscures the actual health burden Māori communities experience. However, an added element with this is that within the Māori population itself, we can see that there are actually large differences between this population standard, which was created in 2001, and say 2019 estimated resident population, which we can see here. And this makes sense because the population has aged, but this means that it's actually more vital to create up-to-date counts and age standards, which actually represent the Māori population. So moving on to age-dependent outcomes using those standards, so WHO, SAGE, and the current Māori population standard, alongside a more recent population estimate, we explored health outcomes like non-fatal injuries, cancer registrations, and mortality. So these are all dependent on age. So from non-fatal injuries from Māori, we could see that the Māori 2001 population standard created lower rates across the time period, which we can see here. And then this continued throughout the cancer registrations and Māori mortality as well. Non-fatal injuries typically are presented through our younger age groups, makes sense. And then these outcomes here are typically reflective for older age groups and demographics. So the Māori 2001 population standard was found to represent these rates, as we can see, but this is likely because the standard isn't representative of the actual age groups for Māori at the time period. So the Māori 2001 population standard likely has less within the older age bands, and therefore we need more recent updates, such as the 2019 standard, which I've got here in blue across all of these plots, which may be more reflective of the population at the time. So changes in population distributions further demonstrate the need for updating methods which can reflect prioritising Māori, and also this influences policy in New Zealand. And these population standards are still derived from census data or Crown infrastructure. So we're dependent on Stats New Zealand's enumeration of the Māori population moving forward, which is unfortunate, but true data sovereignty would actually mean that we have population registers that Māori communities actually trust and control themselves. And alongside that, we would have real-time population data, not just census snapshots in this case. So I've shown you a problem, But for example, how conventional approaches underestimate the Māori health burden. But by integrating data sovereignty to enable new possibilities, we can strategically use Crown data infrastructure to actually serve Māori community needs. So moving from population denominators, I'll be going into an example using a culturally relevant survey. So Te Kupinga was the first official survey in New Zealand which centred Māori wellbeing with culturally relevant variables. And it's a post-census survey with individuals aged 15 years and over, and they are of Māori descent and or ethnicity. So there were 2 iterations of Te Kupinga in 2013 and then in 2018 as well. So the aims of this project were to use or investigate the impacts of administrative data using 2 health outcomes for Māori. In this case, I'll be looking at COVID-19 vaccinations. And sorry, I'm having an issue with my slides. Sorry. So one thing I wanted to make clear again is that this is Crown data infrastructure. So Stats New Zealand does control the survey design, the sampling, and the data collection. However, Te Kupinga is an example that actually utilised Māori consultation and includes variables that matter to Māori communities. So te reo or Māori language proficiency, strength of cultural identity, and whānau wellbeing or family wellbeing. So this isn't a full data sovereignty example, as Māori don't govern Te Kupinga, but it does represent what's currently possible within official statistics, and Māori communities can leverage this data for their own purposes as well. I do have to include this lengthy disclaimer, sorry about this. It's just because I'm about to show you some results which were pulled from microdata as well. So looking at some results which I applied for the Te Kupinga 2013 cohort, looking at this longitudinally. When we examined for COVID-19 vaccinations, looking at uptake using these Te Kupinga 2018 variables, this showed how culturally relevant variables such as how well your whānau doing or family and trust in fair healthcare can influence vaccination experience and uptake differently for Māori. So it's important to stay critical of these results and how it was actually created. So like I say, this is Crown data, and there are a lot of aspects which we have to be mindful of when using this data. But the significance here is that there are patterns which would be completely invisible in traditional health data. And the Ministry of Health collects vaccination data, but they don't collect data on culturally specific variables. So without Te Kupinga in this case, and these elements, we wouldn't be able to understand how COVID vaccinations happen differently within Māori communities based on cultural factors. And there was a relative sampling error of 40%, which is really high. I'm aware of that. But this is because of the longitudinal aspect. And I just wanted to preface that it's a start as well. It hasn't been utilised in this way. I have about 20 seconds, so I'll wrap up quickly. So looking at implications for equitable policy, first of all, like I explained in the beginning, we need appropriate standards or population standards which accurately reflect Māori communities, and changes in population denominators and incorporating recent updates can help move forward through these issues as well, rather than looking at census snapshots through 5-year periods as well. Looking at appropriate measures which accurately reflect Māori communities. So Te Kupinga is an example of this, where although it's not true data sovereignty or Māori data sovereignty, if we were to flip this, it would mean that true sovereignty means that Māori have control over the entire data infrastructure itself. And Māori data sovereignty means that Māori communities can actually have their own health priorities based on what they define as well-being as well. So equitable health policy requires equitable data infrastructures itself, and that means that Māori data governance over technical choices are prioritised, meaning that age standardisation and survey design can also be prioritised in this element as well. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully that came through okay.
Our final talk of today is the third example of Māori data sovereignty and the care principles in a health context. And in this instance, it's Professor Phil Wilcox talking about the care principles of Māori data sovereignty with regards to genetic data. And following this, we're going to get all the speakers to come up to the stage. I'm going to move directly onto the Q&A session. Kia ora, Phil.
Doesn't work. Kia ora tātou, ko te tuatahi tēnei tāku mihi ki ngā mana whenua no te whenua kei waho, te iwi tuago, me te iwi ugeora, tuarua, he mihi hoki ki ngā iwi taki huri no o Ati Ahi Tereiria, tua toru, e te whare atu nei tēnā koe, tua whā, kai mahi, kai ranga hau kukutai mai nei ki konei, hei whakarongo tēnei kōrero, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So that's what I'm going to talk about for all of the time that Andrew will allow me. But primarily about precision health and Māori data sovereignty principles, which very closely align with the care principles. I think I might make one statement, though, because it follows up with these awesome talks that my much younger predecessors, much younger colleagues here have spoken about, and that is our communities typically haven't heard of the care principles, but they have heard of tikanga Māori. That is Māori frameworks, moral and ethical frameworks, and those things quite closely align. So if you address one of those things, you typically address the other as well. So in the context of precision health, what I'm going to talk about is the sort of types of data and then that we generate in precision health research, and then how have we implemented tikanga and also the care principles and the tools that we've developed. But what is precision health? Is that you've probably already read that, but it's coming to a healthcare provider near you. And it refers to individuals' unique characteristics, particularly their genetics, and it's talked about often in the context of genetics, but also environmental or lifestyle factors, as the words say here, predict, prevent, diagnose and treat diseases that are tailored to an individual. And so there's a focus on individual variation, there's a focus on data integration, prevention and treatment, and it extends beyond the existing Western medical model. I just want to make a point here too, both in this country and my country and many other Indigenous communities around the world, or cultures around the world, precision medicine is actually not new. It is something that was practiced by our elders, pre-European days in particular, and they're their own ways of conceptualising these things. So what is needed in a mainstream medical context of contemporary era? I've listed up a bunch of things there, but on top of that is the application of our ethical frameworks, tikanga. And so what are the sorts of data types that we see in a precision health context? DNA sequence information, depending upon the particular disease under investigation. Can be different amounts of data. So family health histories are typically, not typically, but sometimes collected in a very inequitable manner. And then genealogical information is sometimes collected as well. And as Māori, we have knowledge of over 30 generations of ancestors. So that's a considerable feat in itself and can be used to estimate disease risk too, I might add, without any of the other genetic information. From the information from phenotype, what I call phenotype, so age, sex, the usual stuff that can be easily collected in clinic, disease affection status, biomarkers, etc. And then in the research context, often it's these other omics, which are new technologies, and then tissue-specific information as well. The sorts of analyses that are applied can be done in an applied context. Thank you for my meme here. I really like that meme. I teach quantitative genetics and statistics, right? Sometimes at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that is generally the response the students give. Oh my God, I have to... Anyway, so the analyses we undertake are for either diagnostic or prognostic applications in an applied sense, but there's also a lot of analyses that are done for basic research. I won't go into that sort of stuff in much detail, but I want to talk about how we turn these principles of tikanga and care into actual practice in the context of two projects. One is the He Kākano Māori Very Own project, and that project is about, to do that project we recruited over 1,000 people of Māori descent, and the reason for that was to get a full catalogue of DNA sequence variation that occurs in Māori, and that can be applied in for various things in health, both health research, but particularly as a clinical tool for diagnoses of important conditions that affect our communities. 5 minutes, I haven't even got to the key parts yet. And the other project I'll talk to is about putting together a computational platform where we do actually analyses of these data types that I talked about in a permissioned Māori governed environment. So it's not just the database that has Māori governance over it, but it's actually what you do with the data. It also has governance and transparency around it, and it's particularly designed to integrate these different kinds of data and then make it completely clear and transparent to Māori community representatives what the researchers do with those data sets. Now, there's a paper that came out in Nature Genetics, Nature Reviews Genetics, a few years ago that some of us were, including Andrew, were co-authors on, that talked about rights and interests and expectations of Indigenous peoples in regard to unrestricted access to genomic data. And we talked about three key principles in that paper: building trust, enhancing accountability, and improving equity. So to build trust, when we collected, in both of these projects, when we were collecting samples from our communities, we partnered with Māori health providers. We provided a detailed benefits case to them. They BS check it themselves to make sure that it actually makes sense, and we did it in a mainstream medical context as well as using the whare tapa whā model of Sir Mason Jury, which is a well-used Māori model or holistic model of Māori health. We have Māori-led project governance mechanisms, and so the key principle here is Māori governance, again that term governance coming through, over Māori data and genomic resources, and Māori co-led in science delivery, and that includes both Andrew and I, because we oversee or interact with the other data analysts as part of the project. The Very Own project has its own leadership group. Andrew is part of that. Oops, better not destroy the hardware. And our first chair of that was the former minister in one of our previous governments. And that reflected how important that was, this particular mission is to our people. So what is the role of that group? Andrew can speak to this as well as I, probably better than I can, but that includes things like making sure that the benefits case was relevant, was correct, providing interim governance over the resource as we were developing it, ensure the activities were aligning with the communities, etc., and underpinned by appropriate and ethical frameworks. So those are our tikanga frameworks. I've got 2 minutes. So that includes protection of rights, etc. But also there's benefits to researchers as well. This is not a dichotomy where it works for Māori communities but not for researchers. It works for both parties. And I can go into detail around why I think about that, but in the interest of time, just to state that there's a lot of guidelines already for Māori research, for use of Indigenous digital sequence information in genetics type studies that have been in gene technologies, et cetera, et cetera. So in enhancing accountability, we have a number of key points that we need to make there. No secondary use of data within the very own project. It's permanently anonymised. We use traditional knowledge to improve the design and the cost effectiveness of this database, as well as making sure that it is sufficiently broad in terms of the genealogies that we've accessed. And then various improvements in principle, and as well as individual level consent, enabling a return of data to participants should they want it. And then the Rake Ora project, which is our platform development, we had various arms to that study, which included co-design of one of those arms with a tribal entity and representatives of that tribal entity. I'll talk about this Rake Ora project, which is the development of the computational platform, in the next few seconds that I have. But I'm notorious for going over time, and I'll probably earn that reputation again. But basically what we wanted to do was design this prototype of what we were based upon Māori, tikanga Māori, which implemented the care principles. And there are various, so the words here are the words in Māori, but unpacked in terms of what functionalities we wanted in that platform. And so we met with, or engaged with our National eScience Infrastructure team, who themselves had to go through upskilling themselves culturally to enable those criteria, those attributes to be implemented. And so the rest of these slides, which I'll just flick through, they were essentially about included tools and technologies for our community representatives to review research applications, review the outputs, and then do some auditing on information that was generated as a result. This slide is there to keep the geeks happy. We also included in this walled garden environment, which is where researchers actually do the number crunching. They don't do it on their own PCs or on their own supercompute. They do it in this particular environment. So various pipelines. I said before that Māori genealogy information can be used to predict risk, disease risk. So we've got analytical pipeline to do that. So you can read all about it. It's all been published. We've developed we've developed these tikanga-informed attributes for platform development and standards for conducting research in specific contexts. Our ethical frameworks, tikanga, as well as care, provide effective frameworks for the development of these tools for appropriate genomic data use. Benefits can be retained to communities without a repeat of previous negative colonisation experiences that we've seen in multiple genetics-based investigations. And what we've put together is what I would consider world-leading, so it's not a dichotomy at all. So just to say thanks to a whole bunch of people, this team for the Rake Ora project, the He Kākano project, as well as a whole bunch of very learned Māori individuals who have instructed me, mentored me, and assisted in these various endeavours. Kia ora tātou, ko mutu. Pata? Kia ora.
Thanks, Phil. That's a great example to end on, because it's talking about the role of governance and the role of the care principles, whether they be bottom-up informed or as part of the inherently in the project. It's talking about using those to improve the utility and impact of the data that we have access to. And that's especially important about improving the utility and realising the value of Indigenous data resources. Now we have a few minutes for questions, so nā mai haere mai speakers. And so if you have any questions for any of the speakers, please let me know, and just put your hand up, and when you ask a question, just introduce yourself very quickly. And we've got a microphone here. Check that that's working. Right, do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you for this presentation, it's really interesting. I'm from the University of Otago. I'm also the chair of the Information Management Governance Committee there. It sounds like all the universities are in the same spot, like really good intentions, but very slow progress and sort of horror at the status of data. I'm curious to know if there's any collaborative efforts being done across all the universities in Aotearoa.
No.
There's a tiny little one that's based at Otago that's doing a cross-campus initiative for the longitudinal studies. That's it, that I'm aware of.
I think just as well to the extent that Te Mana Raraunga is made up of advocates and people from across different universities, so we're kind of collaborating, but there's nothing that's institutionally led that's collaborative that I'm aware of apart from what Andrew just mentioned. But hopefully we develop something that can be used for all universities. That's the goal.
Is there another question from the floor? Yes.
Hello, my name's Megan from ARDC. In another of my research roles, challenge is, what conversations do you have, I guess, within universities around the time that's required to have these conversations with researchers engaging with communities and having discussions about how they might like this data to be represented, how they might like it deposited, what the access arrangements might be. That takes in my experience, a really long time, and communities are really stretched and under-resourced. So they might not be able to get back to a researcher within 6 months because data governance is not at their forefront when, they've got massive funding pressures. So how do universities consider that when we've got metrics, we have to pump out reports and publications, and we've got this, rightfully so, we need to be able to engage over a long time.
Who wants to answer?
I don't know, have you had any good conversations around that?
So far in our kind of stakeholder engagement, that is one of the issues that is being raised, that there's kind of the competing interests of the institution and community. And I'd like to say that there's a way forward, but the reality is that Māori data sovereignty is kind of an offshoot of kaupapa Māori research in many ways, which has been established and around for decades. And so we know that engagement with Indigenous communities takes time, and I think it takes the time that it takes, but the university still isn't, to my knowledge, doing anything that means that researchers can give time in a way that, the answer to your question is nothing is happening in that space that I'm aware of. But it is something that we're thinking about as we kind of develop these toolkits.
Can I just have a quick one? So there's a good crisis that's on at the moment that might give an opportunity, and that is the crisis in social license for universities that's getting raised. And that's turning some people who are in influential spots to say universities need to have impact. So this is an ongoing issue, that engagement is often around funding opportunities, and to that extent, but there's going to have to be a shift, and maybe this is an opportunity for a push.
I think another big thing too is a lot of Indigenous researchers are still fighting to make that time anyway. So even though we have the university who is constantly telling us we need to commit to our time and our resources are very small, Engagement with community has always been a priority of a lot of Indigenous researchers, so it doesn't matter how much time it's going to take, it will take that amount of time. It's always, though, at the detriment of their own career progression because of the way that institutions understand what impact looks like for research. And I think a lot of impact research priorities have not accounted for what community engagement looks like and what community impact looks like. And so I think it's something that needs to be married up, and that is that research impact at a university and academic space also needs to prioritise what community impact looks like as well. And those conversations are usually around, you know, what journal article has the highest impact to be able to print this research in, but none of it looks like community dissemination. It only looks like academic dissemination. And so once, in my beautiful world, the priority balances itself out. It's about balancing those rights. Those rights of impact, I think, also are something that we need to be talking about, because the impact of the community should be at the same level, if not higher, than a journal. And so I think those are the kinds of things to bring into a space like that. But I'm not sure the university is ready to have a conversation around what that impact looks like when the Globe is trying to push us to go faster and faster.
I guess some of the metrics we are being measured against actually are slowly changing.
Yeah.
Within our ARDCs, we have to demonstrate contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, and community impact. So perhaps things are changing.
Yeah, and it's just, will that continue to balance out to look like academic dissemination impact versus community impact? And if you can see those shifts happening, it's just making sure that we plug into those changes and leverage on the changes that are occurring. And I think that's why we kind of talk about, we don't want to rebuild that wheel. If the wheel is already being built, we just need to add a few more spokes in that recognise that impact.
So if I can add to that, one of those spokes are a lot more capacity and capability within the universities and other types of categories of research providers to engage with Indigenous communities at the front end of research activities, research endeavours, but also forming a relationship with the local tribes and wherever they're located, et cetera, as well as upskilling the researchers at those entities in terms of how to appropriately engage with Indigenous communities. Now, those are three different spokes, but what I've observed is that there's always this pushback for each one of those spokes. Oh, we can't afford it, or we've got other things, other higher priorities, et cetera, et cetera. And in response, I guess, to that is when I've done consultation with communities, particularly around the sort of technologies that, you know, I or colleagues work on, one of the things that we hear is, well, you know, we've been here, in our case, hundreds of years, in this case, tens of thousands of years in this country, and we're not going anywhere. We'll be ready to talk to you guys when you're ready to talk to us in a way that's actually going to be what we would call mana enhancing. So those getting those spokes in place. So I would suggest that those entities actually get a cultural assessment done of their ability to actually effectively engage. And then those sorts of issues that you've quite rightly raised will then be raised again, but they'll actually be raised in the sense of, well, what are some of the solutions that need to be applied?
Yeah. And just wearing my funder's hat, research funder's hat, one of the key issues is that we don't actually approach this as a problem at scale, right? We don't have a research data repository. We don't even have institutional research data repositories. And so we're having a discussion trying to formulate a response at a level where there's not an existing solution and there's no necessarily a pathway to a solution, to have a data repository that can have a data governance solution that includes co-governance. So in that context, that means a lot of people are looking for things that currently work. We're looking for case studies that work. And that's one of the reasons for today to say, here's some different examples in different contexts, in environments where we don't have a national response, we don't even have an institutionally consistent response, but we have some lessons learnt from various case studies of trying to operationalise data sovereignty and the care principles in the New Zealand context. So thank you very much for attending, and I'd like us all to finish by thanking the speakers who have given their insights and their experiences and occasionally some scar tissue. Thanks very much.